It's strange when you put it 20 years. We've been working at some of these problems, and as Tony Scott mentioned in the general session, this truly is a marathon. It's not a sprint, but every once in a while, as I say, you have to do a bit of a pickup. And we do pickups every once in a while, and I run a lot. When we do pickups, it's usually because the conditions have changed. The pack has moved forward, you're running up a hill, you're running down a hill, the conditions have changed, the landscapes have changed, or in certain situations, you might be behind where you want to be on your race pace. So I always talk in analogies. I use a lot of visuals in my presentations. And I'm going to start with a visual that just to sort of set the stage. Normally when I come up and present to folks, we talk, and I speak as a salesperson. That's my role. I lead a sales organization. But I'm going to take off the sales hat for Dell Software, and I'm going to put on a different hat. And that's as a people manager within a large bureaucratic organization. And with that hat on, I'm going to talk about our insider threat mitigation and detection system inside Dell. So I'm going to take the sales hat off for a second, put the hat on that says I'm a mid-level manager in a large bureaucratic organization, and I'm hoping that many of you can identify with that. I have a challenge this morning, and that challenge is to be more interesting than whatever it is you have in your hands. So if you have a device in your hands, my challenge is to be more interesting than Candy Crush or Spider Solitaire or Twitter or God forbid, email. So my challenge right now is to be interesting, and your challenge is to remember some questions, because I am going to leave some time at the end of the prepared remarks so we can have a little bit of a dialogue and we can talk about the material that I'm going to present in a minute. Acronyms. I'm going to use acronyms today. If you don't understand what the acronyms are, just put your hand up. We can explain them. I'm going to start with an acronym that you may be aware of. It's BLUF, B-L-U-F. It's not misspelled. It's actually B-L-U-F. Does anybody know what BLUF stands for? Folks in the military probably know. Bottom line up front. Bottom line up front. And if you go back to your workspace, if you're talking to your significant other, spouse, your friend, whatever, your coworkers, you'd say, all right, what'd that guy from Dell say? You're going to remember 3 words, just 3 words. The bottom line up front: layered, connected, and contextually aware. And I think that second one's hyphenated, so that only counts as 1 word. Layered, connected, and contextually aware. Those are the 3 things that I want you to take away from the presentation. And with that, we'll talk about Dell's Insider Threat Program. Start with a basic premise. Why are we doing this? Why is Dell engaging in an insider threat mitigation program? And the one thing that I would take away from this slide with a lot of numbers on it is in the upper right-hand corner. 70% of breaches can be attributed to human elements. We had a survey come out from our SecureWorks division the other day, and it actually said that they're less interested in tracking malware, not interested, but less interested in tracking malware, because most of the major breaches are happening because of compromised credentials. You don't need to use malware when you have a username and password that's not been protected through 2-factor authentication, as Tony had mentioned earlier. If that's what you're trying to protect from, you really do need to take a different perspective on this. In the corporate world, in the private industry world, the cost of cyber breaches is enormous. In the public sector, it's also quantifiable as well. And last week, there was a solicitation that was issued. It's estimated value of $133 million just for the insurance related to the OPM breach. The real cost of breaches is both on the private sector side and also on the public sector side. Yep. The other item here, and again, lots of numbers, and we'll make these slides available to you. The one thing that I wanted to focus on this slide is really the 97. And for those of you who are in the back of the room, you probably can't read this. It says that 97% of insider threat cases in this survey involved employees whose behavior was flagged by superiors or supervisors as suspicious, but were not followed up on by the organization. So there were known issues going on with the insider, but they weren't followed up on. That's enormously important to understand, is that this information around the insider threat exists. It's yet to be acted upon in a coherent way by the organization. Now, you may be thinking of some of your coworkers who are acting a little suspiciously. Now's the time to actually figure out what to do about that. This also introduces the concept, and the whole section there in the lower right-hand corner talks about potential risk indicators. And we're going to spend a second talking about potential risk indicators. The FBI has actually done a pretty good job of understanding forensically, based on people who have done this kind of activity, what the insider threat profile involves. And if you can read the second sentence in that top paragraph, the thief who is harder to detect and who could cause the most damage is the insider, the employee with legitimate access. And this is one of the reasons I thought that the cybersecurity sprint was really, really insightful. It did not focus on things like encryption, because in the case of the OPM breach, encryption would not have solved the problem, because the person or people who had perpetrated the breach actually had credentials that would have bypassed encryption. What we need is better controls over the insiders, who are very difficult to detect because they have a legitimate identity in the organization. So getting back to the potential risk indicators, what the FBI has identified is a series of attributes that bring people into an elevated level of suspicion. Now, it's getting a little bit paranoid in the room, so we'll talk about this idea of being marginally aware of what we've learned from previous breaches. This isn't about profiling. This isn't about hauling people off for crimes they have yet to commit, but we think they're going to commit. We're not doing Minority Report here. What we are doing is understanding the profile of folks who are likely to commit insider threat activities. Okay? It's pretty straightforward. And we'll talk about how we balance out employee and individual concerns for privacy and personnel rights with the idea of protecting the assets and the information and the workspaces that we are all charged with doing. The one thing that I learned from this, and I've talked to a number of people at the FBI, the one indicator, this is a survey question. Does anybody know what the one indicator is? Best indicator for someone who is likely to commit road rage. Anybody? Yeah, Rebecca knows. She's been in my presentation. I've asked this question before. All right. Personal financial problems, committing road rage. Good guess, but no. In the back. Bumper stickers. So, see, this guy's been in my presentation before. The most accurate indicator of road rage is a bumper sticker. And you say, what's a bumper sticker got to do with road rage? Especially if it tends to be a very, visualized world peace or something like that, or vote for a political candidate that you think is not necessarily very controversial. Everything is controversial with a bumper sticker because you're going to annoy somebody else. And by putting that on your car and displaying that badge, you're seeking affiliation. And if you look at some of the ideas that the FBI has put together, it's people who need to identify, it's people who need to affiliate, it's people who need to display, it's people who are saying they're right and you're not, bless you. And one of the things that happens is that seemingly uncorrelated activity of putting a bumper sticker on the back of your car in road rage is we're searching for the big data elements that actually can lead us to figure out whether somebody is likely to perform some sort of insider activity. Think about connecting dots which don't necessarily seem to be at first blush connected by looking at the potential risk indicators. And the ideas that we've got here is that these potential risk indicators can be factored in and can be measured. If we go back to the presentation earlier today by the director at NOAA, it's correlating vast amounts of information. If you look at the IARPA information that was in the keynote speeches this morning, that correlation of seemingly unrelated data can help us gain insights, but it's knowing where to look and how to do it. We at Dell take this not just as an IT issue. This is actually a workplace safety issue. And this is certainly not an IT issue, and it's certainly not just about information technology. Because one of the things that we look at is holistic security. And we'll talk about this idea of holistic security and the way we approach it from a couple of different dimensions in the next slide or two. But we look at this as preventing the exfiltration of information, certainly with people like Edward Snowden and Bradley/Chelsea Manning, but also with people like Aaron Alexis. And Aaron Alexis was a shooter at the Navy Yard who used his credentials to gain physical access to a space that he should not have access to. So we at Dell actually tie together the idea of the physical and the logical. And using those sorts of data points, physical and logical, and the technology which we have, which the federal government has, excuse me. Oops, my badge is not with me. My badge is in my briefcase. My badge actually allows me physical access to my building, my suite, other places, but that information is also correlated in with my information technology access, where I log in, what kind of device I use, and so forth. So we look at this as both a physical as well as a cyber security issue. The call to action. We on the private sector side have had a series of calls to action. And I'm going to fast forward through this one because the next slide, if I can get the next slide to come up, on the bottom is actually coming to pass much faster. And so there have been a series of legislative bills and policies in the last probably month or so, which has substantially accelerated the obligation of federal government contractors to comply with the rules that the federal government itself has to comply with. And that's one of the reasons that we Dell, are accelerating our insider threat program. It's being mandated. We were doing it before. We were doing it because it was the right thing to do. Now all the work we've put into it for the last several years is going to come forward, and it's going to help us comply with the regulations that are actually becoming true policies as opposed to just recommendations. So what you're seeing is advances in the policies that are directing federal government contractors to employ things like two-factor authentication, to implement things like data exfiltration and insider threat policies and procedures. So the rules are pressing the private sector as the rules are also pressing the public sector. Excuse me. This is all moving very, very quickly. It's all moving very, very quickly. And the other idea is that what's good for the public is also good for the private. The challenge is we're a very large, complex, geographically distributed, legacy technology-driven, budget-constrained, competitive. That's us. That's not you, okay? But we're all the same. We're all dealing with the same issues, which is legacy applications, large, unwieldy IT organizations which are constantly being pressed to deliver more with less and to reduce the cost of compute and to take advantage of all these new technologies like cloud and big data and improve results at the same time improving security. So what we are feeling as a large organization of about 100,000 people globally is probably what you're all feeling too. Okay. Here's a case study for us, and this is really digging into what Dell is doing internally. Okay, again, remember I took off my sales hat. I'm now talking about me as a middle-level manager with a number of employees in an organization. What we started with, and as I mentioned before, is a holistic approach. And the holistic approach is not just the various disciplines within information technology. The holistic approach started with the idea of looking at various disciplines inside the organization. It's a top-down approach to managing risk across the enterprise and admitting that risk is never zero. This isn't about achieving quote-unquote checkbox security. This is about mitigating risk and understanding that the idea is a risk-driven decision-making in the line of business that can help people make educated decisions. And it's governance across silos to enhance the information sharing and the shared risk decisions. It's not just IT. It could be finance. It could be HR. It could be operations. It could be sales and marketing, where I stand. Okay? And it's establishing concepts of operations that impact all of those different parts. And what we had to do first really is look at governance. And if you look at some of the NIST cybersecurity frameworks, if you look at any of the guidelines on how to create good security, it usually starts with governance. Governance is about who makes the rules and who can change the rules and who's going to have to abide by the rules. And one of the things you'll see here is that the governance body that oversees this can start with our general counsel, our legal folks. It actually goes into our human capital officer, chief human capital officer. That's HR. Again, we haven't even touched IT. This is not an IT issue. We also look at the chief financial officer, because if there's one thing that CFOs want to measure and monetize, it's risk. But those three individuals sit on a board, and then there's a rotating executive leadership contribution from the executive steering committee. And you can see below that there are representatives. But it's rotating through. It's not a standing, static, stagnant bureaucracy. It's designed to be rotating through. It's designed to get that governance across the organization to look at this holistically. And there are various work groups that are created. It was funny because when I first read this presentation, I looked at it and I said, there's an IT working group. And I thought they meant information technology. No, IT in this case does not mean information technology. That's insider threat. So we've got to transform our perspective away from this idea that this is an IT issue and to looking at this holistically and governed by various aspects of the organization. If you don't get the governance right, the IT can never be right. So start with the governance and make sure you've got executive top-down buy-in from the top on what needs to be done. So once we decided who was going to make the rules, who was going to have to play by the rules, and who could change the rules, as a large bureaucratic organization, we did what everybody does, which is we had to come up with a big, huge flowchart. We had to come up with a bunch of diagrams. We had to look at capabilities, and we had to look at tools. Okay? One of the things that we looked at is the idea of the data that's going to be started. And if you start on the left-hand side, you can see the data that's going to be fed into this risk analysis engine. And then in the middle, you'll see what the engine is. And then the outcomes or the outputs are on the right-hand side. What we're doing now is actually feeding a variety of information through a scoring system based on the FBI's profile idea of potential risk indicators, taking that data, run it through the engine, and then making some decisions. Again, we're not talking about hauling people off in handcuffs just because they come up as an elevated risk. Certain people engage in risky behavior. That's their job. Some of our engineers, for instance, have to go to places which are not so nice. That's their job. Just because they're in a not-so-good place doesn't mean that they're immediately deemed to be non-compliant. It's a risk to be evaluated and investigated. And that's really the premise of this whole application, is feeding information in, seemingly disparate information in some situations, analyzing it through the lens of risk, and then taking appropriate actions in the business, Okay? And one of the things that we talked about at the beginning, remember, was layers, right? And we talked about context-aware, right? Context-aware is one of the other interesting issues. And we'll talk about some of the systems that feed in here that provide that level of context awareness, okay? The other thing that large bureaucratic organizations do is hire integrators and consultants. And that's exactly what Dell did. So what we ended up doing was hiring, in this case, Lockheed Martin and Deloitte. And so what we looked at was the tools that they would recommend that they could integrate quickly based on the systems that we've got in-house and the environment that we're operating in, and then looked at how we could both bring that to market quickly, leverage what we had internally so we didn't have to start from scratch, but also we looked at, within the software group inside Dell, some of the intellectual property that we have that could be brought to bear to the problem. And we talk about this idea of drinking our own champagne. We have this phrase of Dell on Dell. We use our own software inside our own organization in order to achieve the business objectives that we want. Now, our CIO can actually go out and buy whatever she wants. Our CIO can go off and buy the best tool in order to achieve the business outcome, because that's what she's tasked with doing. The idea is that she looked at this and said, this combination of both the integrator, the consultant, and some external tools, plus some internal tools, gave us the best probability to succeed in this insider threat analysis engine. Okay? Let me go to the next slide. Clicker wants to work. There we go. Okay, here's the prototype idea. And again, if you look on the left-hand side, this is the kind of information that's being collected. We're taking PeopleSoft information in from our HR system, Access Commander and Lenel OnGuard, and also RSA for a data loss prevention tool. Those are all being fed in and looked at and converted. So it's some structured information, some non-structured information, some HR data, some information from other systems. But it's not just network logs. It's not just where did you log in, although that information comes in as well. So it's trying to get a more holistic view of that user and understanding what he or she is doing at that point in time. Again, converting that information, putting it in a big data platform called Hadoop, and if anybody's in the big data world, you'll understand what that means. We analyze the information using our own tool called Statistica, and then we produce a dashboard. We're visualizing the results of that and scoring that risk, and then what we have is a series of flags. Okay? One of the things that we are working towards is users are being flagged. The dashboard is anonymous. This doesn't say that Paul Christman needs to be investigated by the security police. What it says is user ABC needs to be investigated by the appropriate role within the organization based on the governance model of that individual. So we're flagging individuals anonymously through the dashboard. The idea then becomes there is a business process for approaching that employee with respect and also the confidentiality that's necessary based on the information that's being ingested and analyzed. It's really, really important to understand that we have to balance out employee rights to privacy and HR policies and this idea of risk and security. It can't be that everybody has access to every piece of information about every employee and the guy who's watching the dashboard gets to see all that information. That would be inappropriate. And there are a number of cases that are happening in the last 2 weeks or so where this kind of idea of who has access to what information and how do you balance out privacy concerns and certainly things like HIPAA data or PII data as it relates to a risk engine. So we've solved this problem by looking at alerts, and we consider them to be leads for investigation as opposed to a sentence, judge, and jury. Okay? It's really important to understand that the lead is followed up on within the context of the organization with a person who has the appropriate training and the right to know. And the clicker wants to go. All right, we're going to put new batteries in this thing. All right, this is what it looks like. This is what it looks like, and it's pretty hard for you all to see on the bottom. Those are just numbers. Those are not people's names, and they are going to be scored, right? Some of the employees in the room who are chuckling right now, they're looking for their own name on that report. You won't find it there. Only some of us are looking for their names. So what we're looking at is a pilot population of about 500 employees, and it's likely to start with the organization that deals directly with the federal government. Some of us have security clearances. That puts us in a special class of employees. We have sacrificed some of our own personal information in order to have a security clearance which grants us information access within a customer set. We've also agreed, just sort of a social contract with our employer, that they're going to be allowed to look at other parts of our lives that your rank and file everyday employee would not. So we're going to start with about 500 employees. The idea really that I wanted to convey with this slide is that about two people looking at this dashboard could handle about 500 users. And we haven't scaled it out yet, but we want to have at least 2 people looking at the dashboard for a little bit of redundancy and also a little bit of sort of cross-checking. But this doesn't need to be 500 people watching 500 other people, right? This should be a fairly operationally light endeavor based on the technology and analysis engine that's been put in place and the decisions that have been made. Okay? The other thing to focus on here in the upper right-hand corner is to look at the various information. We mentioned PeopleSoft before, but the other thing that you might notice is Taleo, which we use for recruiting, which we use for applying for internal positions. HR analytics, we also are ingesting data from Concur. And Concur is a cloud-based tool which we use for travel reservations and also expense reporting. Two really, really important things that get to where somebody is supposed to be and what sort of things they think the company should be reimbursing. Gets to financial data and also gets to that idea of where that person is. Gets to that contextually aware security profile. And it says, okay, if all of a sudden my American Express data is showing that I am submitting expense reports for something in Las Vegas, for instance, but Concur says I've never taken the company flight to Las Vegas and I'm submitting these expenses to the company, there's something that doesn't make any sense. Again, the contextually aware, the geographically contextually aware security profile that can be generated by looking at our travel and expense reporting system and also our PeopleSoft system and our HR system and our Taleo systems is really, really bringing us forward. It's not just looking at computer logs. What device did I use to log into what network and what information? Keep in mind we also use other public cloud systems like our CRM system is Salesforce.com. If, for instance, my organization is the federal government space and I'm periodically running reports and downloading information about my pipeline of federal government sales opportunities, that's entirely appropriate. And that would be something that the system would see me do on a fairly frequent basis. But if all of a sudden my job didn't change, HR knew that, and I'm all of a sudden downloading all sorts of information about our commercial clients, maybe in Eastern Europe, that would be two things you'd probably want to correlate and say that behavior in the CRM system is not corroborated with a change in role in the HR system, therefore it's a security flag. Again, contextually aware, correlating this information back to say that kind of behavior is worth investigating. Okay. The other thing, and this chart is kind of ugly, we're working on the user interface for the application, but the item to convey here is the horizontal axis in this chart is actually time. Get away from the idea that security is a checkbox, it's earned and never reinvestigated. Security clearances are investigated and reinvestigated and reinvestigated, and the frequency at which they're done, it depends on the level of access and the depth of your security clearance. We're looking at this as a near real-time system. Near real-time is in minutes and days rather than months, weeks, years. So what we're trying to do is to say someone's personal situation may have changed. They may have something going on at home that's amping up one of those potential risk indicators. Something happening at home always spills over to work. And again, it gets back to the idea that most people in the workplace know what's happening with their coworkers. They get a sense that, you know, Bobby's a little bit off. Bobby's been a little bit distracted. Bobby's been a little bit irritable. Bobby's been a little bit tired, not sleeping, distracted, under a lot more pressure. All those things happen, and they happen in real time, and so our idea of the potential risk indicators needs to be in that level of speed, that frequency of check-in. So the idea of a security profile or a risk profile changing over time really is something that's built into the system. Again, you don't get accredited or secure clearance, and then we never check again. And the check is very, very frequent. Okay. I'm going to take off my middle manager hat for a second. I'm going to put my sales hat back on. Okay? So for right now, we're going to talk about some of the things that Dell Software does and that Dell as a company does. And I only put these, there's blessedly only 2 slides at the end that are sales related. So the only reason I put this in here is because we try and follow the message we take with our customers around looking at compliance, enabling the business, and protecting the assets. And one of the things that we come back with is security should not be something that prevents people from getting their jobs done. And we've done a whole series of surveys lately that says if security is onerous and prevents people from actually accomplishing their mission, there's no better industry segment than the federal government workforce at bypassing security if it gets in the way of them doing their job. So one of the things we're really trying to do is to get away from this idea that security is about saying no. Security should be about enabling the business. And I'm going to fold that back into the ideas that we had before, is that this is a shared, holistic approach of looking at the risk of the business and enabling the business to mitigate the risk in order to move forward to accomplish the mission, as opposed to security saying no, no, no. Okay? I'm going to buzz through the last couple because I told you I was going to ask questions at the end. And I told you I'd buzz through these at the end. And I think we're just about done, and I've got 6 minutes left. Come on. We're going to put new batteries in the clicker. All right. We've got about 6 minutes left. And I told you I was going to ask questions. So I'm opening it up to questions. Ideas, thoughts, comments, concerns. Yes, sir.
I noticed that Dell has a website focused on the NIST cybersecurity framework.
Mm-hmm.
How does that fold in? I know you talked to the holistic approach to risk management,
Mm-hmm.
and it seems like the government is more focused on the latest and greatest detection devices versus the process of how you manage it after you detect something. And I know Tony has talked to getting the focus from the technology to more looking at the process.
Right.
But yet we have contracts like CDM that doesn't have risk management until like the third phase. Seems like it should be more upfront.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for noticing that we have produced an awful lot of mapping of our technology solutions and our sort of concepts to the NIST framework. The NIST framework, if you start with the beginning, it's about asset understanding and it's about governance. And then you get into detection, and then you go through, and then you get to mitigation, and then you get to improvement. But the first step really is embodied here, which is really starting about understanding what your environment is, what you're trying to protect from, sort of risk identification, and that's really the beginning of the NIST cybersecurity framework, and that's really where we started as well. It's really, really challenging when somebody says, but I need to go solve technology problem down here. Really, it's about starting to understand why you're doing it, what's the risk, what's the impact to the business, what are you trying to protect from what or whom, and then designing an appropriate solution. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's not, okay, if everybody enabled encryption, we'd all be secure, or if everybody enabled two-factor authentication, we'd all be secure, because that may not be what you should be protecting from. And if you build that on a foundational understanding of your infrastructure that's weak, you're never going to get any better. So the idea of CDM really talks about asset inventory at the beginning, understanding the IT items in your environment, and then protecting. CDM and NIST and what we're presenting here, they interconnect, but one of the things that we're trying to do is to say, we're trying to protect from insiders. That's our mission right now, and that's this project. That doesn't mean we're also not doing asset management, endpoint device encryption, perimeter protection, all sorts of other things in addition to this insider threat, but it all weaves together. And it's a business decision by the organization as to where you start. The NIST framework, I really think of, it should be presented in a different way, but it looks like a recipe that you start at the top and end at the bottom. That's really not, you can start anywhere in the NIST cybersecurity framework. CDM is a bit of a different beast. We'd be glad to talk a little bit about how that all fed into the decision-making process for us. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Who are potential threats? Who approaches them? How do you handle it?
Yeah, good question. The question is, all right, once you've identified a threat, how is it pursued? We look at the flag on the insider threat dashboard as a flag. Based on what it is and who it is, it usually will go back up through the management chain for the person's supervisor to basically sit down and say, all right, I'm concerned about you as an employee. Is there anything we can do? It's a very open-ended conversation. It usually goes back to their supervisor, because the supervisor has that obligation in the organization to help an employee understand what their resources are. More often than not, we're having conversations at that level, and the supervisor's identified and said, okay, Sally's having a bit of an issue. Can you please sit down and help Sally understand what resources are available to help balance out work-family life problems? We start with the idea first as help as opposed to prosecute. And it usually starts with the supervisor, the direct first-line supervisor. This is not somebody parachuting from the, out of the sky. We'll probably have somebody from HR, which we usually do anyways, any sort of personnel issue. So we'll usually have the supervisor and an HR person either on-site or over the phone. But that's just good everyday personnel management. We're just using this as an indicator that the person maybe needs help. More often than not, what we find is people are very happy to talk about it, and they're happy to understand that assets and resources that the company helps our employees with. They usually don't turn contentious. Yes, sir.
Yes. Did I understand you correctly that the OPM breach, you're saying folks had credentials that allowed them to bypass the encryption? If I did, could you talk a little bit about that? And if I did understand you correctly, could you address whether or not the folks would be able to not through the encryption?
So as I understand it, what I've learned about the OPM breach is the data was not encrypted, and even if it had been encrypted, the credentials that they had gained access to that had been compromised would have been able to bypass it anyway, because there were systems administrator passwords, right? And systems administrator passwords typically are granted very, very high rights that would have been able to bypass it. Encryption of data at rest on mobile devices is fantastic, right? You lose the device and so forth, but encryption of a data center database should rely on that layered security, and they should never have gotten there with a simple username and password, which is one of the reasons that the big push from the cybersecurity sprint was two-factor or multi-factor authentication, especially for privileged users. And it was as a privileged, elevated systems administrator username and password which was compromised in the OPM breach, as far as I know. So the idea is encryption wouldn't have fixed it. Two-factor authentication would have mitigated it. No way to promise that it wouldn't have happened, but it would have been substantially harder for it to happen because a simple username and password would have been useless. You have to have some other token, other factor, biometric. Doesn't matter what the other factor is, but as soon as you add that next layer, especially for systems administrators who have very, very broad access, we really would look at that and say that probably would have mitigated the risk. Not eliminated the risk, but it would have mitigated the risk. All right, one last question, then we got to wrap. Yes, sir.
Are you leveraging external databases to create demographic profiles of employee base?
For instance?
Economic data on employees?
No more than we already have. So we're not getting their bank information. Right? That's private information, but we do understand their payroll information because we produce it ourselves. But yes, the payroll data is coming in, but we're not getting after bank data. We are looking at, in the next iteration of the application, actually looking at publicly available information. So that will include things like LinkedIn, things like Twitter, things like Facebook, those sorts of things which are publicly available, but we're not going to go interrogate somebody's bank accounts. It's that fine line. Yep. But again, the payroll information is pretty straightforward. Yeah. Okay. Appreciate your time this morning. Really do thank you for attending. If there's any other questions y'all have about how Dell is doing this or things we can provide for you as an end user agency, we'd be glad to talk to you about it. Again, thank you very much.